Our next session will cover both theaters as we look at the destruction World War II brought upon the world in a session entitled In the Rubble. Our longtime friend of the museum, current convener of our museum's presidential counselors, Dr. Allan Millett, will chair this session. Allan is a preeminent military historian in the United States and is the author of many books, but certainly A War to Be Won is a classic that should be in everyone's bookcase. Hopefully it's one that they've actually opened and leafed through and read as well. Now, after years at the Ohio State University, we're fortunate to have Allan move down here and teach at the University of New Orleans so that we can have frequent collaboration. This panel for this roundtable includes Keith Lowe and Dr. Donald Bishop, both of whom will provide insight really on the destruction the war left behind around the globe. So with that, and your path of destruction, Allan, take it away.
I often feel that the path of self-destruction is, getting up here at the microphone. But I first of all want to thank all of you who've been such stalwart patrons of the museum. I think some of you know I was sort of president of creation as a minor player, and it's really a delight to see how much we've accomplished in the last 20-some years. Personally, I want to thank those of you who've come up and said hello, and I appreciate your friendship, and want to remind you that there was something called the Korean War, and there are lots of really good books out there about that, with 2 more on the way. Okay. Our staff here is so good that we really don't have to worry too much about introductions because they've done a really good job at talking about our real presenters in the program that you have. So rather than tell you what you can read easily, I'm going to forego that other than to say that we're certainly privileged to have Keith and Don here for this session. I do want to recognize that Don and I have been friends for a long time, and he was a student of mine at Ohio State sometime after the Second Punic War. and even more than that, he's helped me immensely in my work on Korea and China. And I treasure the times that we've spent with him and his family in Beijing. Well, before I collapse in some maudlin act of self-destruction, I think I'll turn the microphone over to Keith and we'll get to the real business of this session. Thank you.
Right. Well, it's good to be here. I'm just, right at the moment, I'm just finishing a book. And I mean, I'm actually just finishing it. My deadline is in 3 weeks' time. So, I've cancelled all my appointments for the end of this year, except this one. Because, this is a big deal. This is an important conference, friendly people, intelligent audience with intelligent questions. So, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Right. So I'm here to talk about post-war Europe. Yesterday, we heard a bit about this in other sessions. We heard about the Nuremberg trials. We heard about the Marshall Plan, all this sort of rebuilding that takes place after the war's over. This is kind of our standard narrative about World War II. The war finishes, the reconstruction begins. But there's a gap there in between these two things, which is a bit more difficult to define, really. It's not quite war, but it's not quite peace either. It's sort of this murky in-between place. And we rarely talk about this. Perhaps we don't talk about it because it is so murky and difficult to define, but I think there are other reasons. It doesn't quite suit us to talk about it. And maybe we can get onto that a bit later. For the moment, though, I want to just plunge us straight in and just sort of paint a picture of what Europe looks like after the war is over. First of all, there is a lot of physical destruction. I mean, I saw some of this myself when I was a child. I grew up in an apartment. Directly opposite, on the other side of the street, there was a bomb site. I used to play in there as a kid, you know. This was a normal part of life in London when I was growing up. All the streets had sort of gaps in them where houses used to be. Nobody really spoke about this. It was just a fact of life. The cities of Europe were filled with gaps like this. Naples, Turin, Milan had these gaps. Marseille had these gaps. Caen in northern France, more than just gaps. I mean, the whole place was leveled. The further east, of course, you go, the worse the damage gets. Hamburg, Dresden, Pforzheim, Würzburg, these cities were destroyed by firestorms in World War II. Warsaw was systematically destroyed, house by house, street by street, with kind of typical German efficiency, you could say. 90% of Warsaw was destroyed during the war. Now, for us, of course, this is very difficult to imagine. You look at the cities of Europe today, you could hardly tell, right? I mean, they're thriving places. It's difficult for us to get our heads around this, but it was difficult even for those who were there, who saw it, to understand what it was they were seeing. I've got a quote from a guy in my book who was working for the United Nations, went to Warsaw in 1946. He wrote a letter back to his wife, and he said in this letter, "I just can't understand how this could have been done. It's something so vicious. I just can't quite believe it." Alongside this physical destruction, of course, you also have human destruction. How do you imagine 35 million dead? There's a photo in my book of a guy called Philip Paluch. He lost 55 members of his extended family back in Poland. He was the last one left. In fact, he didn't bother going back to Poland after the war. There was no point. There was no one there for him. What does that do to a person? So you see, it's not only the cities that are broken, the streets that have gaps and so on. It's also there are broken people coming out of the war. I want to tell you a story about a friend of mine called Andrei Chernyayev. He's someone who's had quite a big influence on me, actually, certainly in what I write. Andrei was there at the end of the war. He was a 9-year-old child when the war ended. He and his mother were kidnapped from Poland in 1943, and they were taken to Germany as kind of slave laborers. They worked in farms in southeast Germany, around Dresden. Certainly that's where he was liberated. Now, according to Andrei, when the war was over, there was nothing but chaos around him. Nobody came to liberate him, let alone look after this kid and his mother. The armies just swept through. They weren't interested in a child and his mother at all. There were no police forces around. Those two had been swept away. There was no government. There were no doctors, no nurses. All the transport infrastructure had been destroyed. There were no shops. There was no food. He and his mother had to walk for 1 month across war-torn Germany just to find any kind of institution that was capable of looking after them. Eventually, they made their way to a displaced persons camp in the American zone. This was run by the United Nations, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. Now, even this DP camp, this displaced persons camp, was, pretty chaotic. Andrei told me some stories about what he and the other 9-year-old kids used to get up to when their mothers weren't looking. One of them found an ammunition dump nearby this DP camp. And so they used to go there to play and, grab the ammunition and do all kinds of things with it. One of the things they did was they also found a metal stove which they took a machine gun sort of belt of ammunition and shoved it into this stove, and then set fire to it and stood back and watched bullets ping out of this thing in all directions. He said there was a time he found a Panzerfaust, and they had great fun firing this thing across the valley and watching the explosions. He said that was really good fun. Now, I know you Americans like your guns, right? But you draw the line somewhere, don't you? Nobody advocates giving rocket-propelled grenades to 9-year-olds. You also have a police force here. You know, if guys with guns start trouble, there's someone to stop them, right? There's a thing called civil society. There's the rule of law. There are constraints on people's behavior here. None of these things existed in large parts of post-war Europe in the ruins, in the aftermath of the war. There were no police forces. There was no rule of law. And lots of the moral constraints that people would normally have had also broken down because of the experiences that they had had during the war. So what happens when you have no institutions, no rule of law, and an abundance of weapons that anybody can get their hands on, even 9-year-old children? Well, I mean, you can imagine the answer. The violence, of course, does not stop with the end of World War II. It continues. There is a crime wave which sweeps across Europe in the aftermath of the war. There's looting and theft everywhere. You know, people are hungry. If there's a train coming in with food, they're not going to wait for it to be distributed. They descend on this and start looting it. And anyone who gets in their way, well, woe betide them. This is also a time when people settle old scores. You know, this doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with the war. If you've got a feud with your neighbor, now is the time to sort it out. You know, just call him a collaborator, and you can do what you like with him. There is vengeance on collaborators everywhere. I mean, in France, for example, it's estimated around 9,000 people were put up against the wall and shot. This is after the liberation. Northern Italy is even worse. You know, after April 45, May 1945, even conservative estimates say that 12,000 fascists were summarily executed by partisans and so on. Germans, nobody likes Germans after the war. If you've got a population of Germans in your country, you expel them, get rid of them. You don't want them there. So, for example, that fringe of Czechoslovakia, around the western fringes of Czechoslovakia, historically known as the Sudetenland, where 3 million Germans had lived for centuries. They are all expelled at the end of 1945, 1946. And to encourage them to go, there is a great amount of violence. Poland's the same. 5 or 6 million Germans who lived in those areas are expelled from Poland. It's estimated, I mean, these estimates are always a little bit vague for obvious reasons. There's not a lot of documentation around at the time because it's such chaos. But most scholars now agree around 300,000 Germans died, either were killed directly or died through the cruelty they received in the wake of the liberation. There's all kinds of other kinds of violence which takes place after the war. I don't have time to go into all of them, of course, but I cover them all in my book, Savage Continent, so check that out. I'm also thinking of running an online course at some point next year, but who knows? You can contact me through my website if you're interested. What I want to ask you today, though, is why? Why don't we hear about all this more often? This is a big deal, right? It's hundreds of thousands of people lose their lives, are directly killed after World War II is supposed to be over. So why don't we talk about it? Why do we leap straight from World War II to the Reconstruction? Why do we miss out this bit in between? And the answer, I think, has quite a lot to do with our memory of World War II. and the way we mythologize it. Perhaps we can get onto that in the question, but I think it's mostly because our view of World War II doesn't quite fit into the way we like to think about it. You know, we have a very narrow idea, I think, of what World War II actually was. We like to think of it as this simple conflict between the Axis on one side and the Allies on the other. And as soon as the Axis is defeated, we can then move on to the reconstruction, right? But World War II wasn't only that. There's loads of other things going on. I mean, that's the sort of umbrella war, but underneath there's loads of other little conflicts that are taking place all over the world, especially in Europe. Ethnic cleansing, for example. You know, the most famous example, the Holocaust. This is not part of World War II, but World War II creates the conditions which allow the Holocaust to take place. You would like to think, wouldn't you, that, you know, May 1945, the Holocaust comes to an end, everyone leaves Jews alone. But that's not the case. Jews are still persecuted in 1945, 1946, 1947. You know, the most famous pogrom of the time was Kielce in Poland. But there were many others. There were similar massacres of Jews happening in Slovakia, Hungary, and various other places. That's not the only sort of ethnic cleansing that takes place. There's also, on the borderlands between Poland and Ukraine, disputed borderlands, in 1943, a war starts up between the locals, between the Poles and Ukrainians who are trying to massacre each other. Just because the war has moved on and the Germans have gone and been defeated, it doesn't mean that these people have to stop fighting. And of course they don't. They carry on up until 1947. There's still this ethnic war going on. There are all sorts of political wars which start because they're allowed to by World War II. So, you know, most famously you have, well, you've got the left versus the right is usually the thing, right? So in Yugoslavia, for example, you've got royalist partisans fighting the Germans. You've got Tito's partisans fighting the Germans. The Chetniks and Tito's partisans, they're just as interested in fighting against each other as they are against the Germans. Once the Germans go, they carry on. Ethnic cleansing carries on into 1946 until the last Chetnik has been done away with. And of course, in the 1990s, we see this reprised with the new civil war in Yugoslavia, where the same echoes of ethnic cleansing happen all over again. That's the sort of main message I think I wanted to give you. The fact that the war doesn't end, there's all these other little things going on underneath it. There's plenty more I can say, but I think it's time to hand over to Don. Thank you very much.
Yeah, nicely done. Yeah.
My talk is about China during and after the war. There was plenty of rubble and ruin and struggle and death. But let me begin on a more personal note. I was in the Air Force after college, and all proper Air Force stories begin with two hands, sort of like dogfighting. And there I was. Even though if it's not a story about flying. So there I was, working at the American Embassy in Beijing in 2005, the 60th anniversary of VJ Day, victory over Japan. And it fell to me to be the embassy representative at Chinese events marking the end of World War II in Asia. Now, I had read 30 Seconds Over Tokyo and God is My Co-Pilot when I was young. So for me, the best part was meeting some of the heroes of my boyhood. I spent hours with two of the Doolittle Raiders, a half dozen of the original Flying Tigers, and those who followed them in the 14th Air Force, the pilots who had flown over the hump of the Himalayas to supply China by air, and other Army officers and soldiers who had pushed across Burma to open the Stillwell Road to allow supplies to flow from India to China. 60 years after the war, they were old, but their stories were still young. And I met Chinese who had been translators and interpreters for the Americans, and a Chinese nurse who had cared for Americans in a U.S. Army hospital. At a ceremony, we Americans saluted an elderly Chinese who, as a teenager, had helped build the great airfields across Chengdu, used by the American B-29 Superfortress bombers. I visited Kunming, the headquarters of the 14th Air Force, and Chongqing, known as Chongqing then, China's wartime capital. It had been bombed relentlessly by the Japanese. When I visited, the rubble was long gone, but the dugouts and tunnels that had been dug into the city's cliffs to shield people and factories from the Japanese bombs were still there. The American Embassy at that time published a magazine in Chinese, and in that VJ plus 60 year, we published many articles about the cooperation of Americans and Chinese during the war. In telling these stories, we were filling a vacuum in Chinese history, since for decades, the Communist Party had barred any mention of American support during the war. We showed a 1945 Army film with fresh Chinese subtitles at the Diaoyutai State Guest House. A woman behind me exclaimed, "This story hasn't been told for years." So here, let's first provide a frame for World War II and its aftermath in China. Now, China's internationally recognized government was the Republic of China, founded in 1911 by Sun Yat-sen, but led since 1926 by Chiang Kai-shek. Facing the Japanese, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists confronted the Japanese with regiments, divisions, and armies organized on European lines. While the nationalists had a core of good units, some trained by German advisors in the 1930s, others trained by the US at Ramgarh in India, the great body of the nationalist formations had been recruited originally by regional warlords. They were less well-armed, less well-trained, less well-disciplined, and less reliable. Once the US entered the war, units of the US Army Air Forces battled the Japanese in the air and supported China's ground troops. But other members of the US Army in China were advisors, only advisors, to key nationalist units. There never was an American division, brigade, regiment, or battalion deployed to China during the war. And while the Americans on land and in the air played important roles in China's war, there really weren't many of them. At the close of the war, there were 3 million Americans in the European theater, but only 60,000 Americans in China. There were obstacles to effective nationalist resistance to Japan. During the war, Chiang Kai-shek, when he chose commanders, prized personal loyalty over military expertise, and he trusted his own strategic decisions even in the face of better advice. All this had diminished the effectiveness of the nationalists. Also, Americans in China during and after the war gave abundant testimony that military and civilian cronies throughout the nationalist government put money, tax funds extorted from their own people, war aid from the United States, into their own pockets. They abused their common soldiers and local civilians. Generals and other officials never grasped that the old concept of profiting from official position sapped China's war effort. Now, America helped, especially in the air, but the real burdens of the war fell on China's own people. Remember, the war in China began in 1937, and it lasted 8 years. 8 long years of a few victories here, more defeats there, millions of refugees, millions of deaths, and untold agonies. Combining military and civilian deaths over 8 years, more than 8,000 Chinese died of war causes each day. 8,000 a day. Chiang and the Nationalists also faced domestic opposition from the Communist Party of China, led by Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao. The Nationalists and the Communists had warred with one another, a brutal civil war for a decade from 1927 to 1937. Before the war with Japan opened, the Nationalists had the upper hand, and the Communist leadership was holed up in a dusty town in China's northwest, Yan'an. But after Japan attacked China in 1937, the Nationalists and the Communists declared a united front against the Japanese. Now, how did this united front work? The Nationalists fought the real battles against Japanese armies, even though their arms, training, and supplies were inferior. The graduates of the Nationalist Military Academy were ardent patriots, but 40% of them were killed in battle in the war's first year. The Communists, on the other hand, fought a guerrilla war against the Japanese, communist skirmishes compared to nationalist battles, and they prepared to resume the Civil War. What the Communists were doing during the war was building the political and social infrastructure for a new kind of China after the surrender of the Japanese and what they hoped would be defeat of the Nationalists. The Japanese had taken and occupied vast areas of northern, eastern, and coastal China, garrisoning the cities. But out in the countryside were liberated areas controlled by the Communist Party. Communist control in so much of the North had some good effects for the U.S. war effort. If any American aircrew were downed in the North, the Communists organized their escape to rejoin their units farther south. In those liberated areas, however, the Communists' main effort was to win over peasants, recruit soldiers, and organize a vast militia. They could ride the hatred felt by all Chinese for the Japanese, who were first, despised foreigners, and second, extremely brutal in their rule. The Communists strictly disciplined their own troops to be helpful and polite as they moved through villages. These were the carrots. There were sticks, too. In newly liberated areas, party cadres studied the social stresses between landowners and tenants, between clans, disparities of wealth, and the long-standing resentments ubiquitous in Chinese rural society. The cadres soon labeled individuals and families by class, following the Soviet example by dividing them into landlords, rich peasants, middle peasants, poor peasants, and laborers, and factored in any collaboration with the Japanese. They enacted land reform, depriving old owners of their property, and those who received the new titles to the seized lands became ardent supporters of the party. They also organized struggle sessions, encouraging angry villagers to denounce and brutalize, even kill their class enemies. Those who did also became more ardent in their support of the party. Now, when the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan and the emperor ordered his forces to surrender, China was still divided. Geographically, the Communists were strong in the north, while the Nationalists were in the south and southwest. Politically, the Nationalists and Communists had radically different social orders. So let me turn to the period after the war. We've all seen the photographs of the Japanese surrender on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 3rd, 1945. Less well known are other surrender ceremonies. One was in Nanjing, China's liberated capital, when Nationalist China accepted the surrender of Japanese forces in China and Taiwan. Now, for Japan, peace followed the surrender, and under American occupation, Japan was gradually transformed into the nation it is today. But for most of Asia, years of war and conflict followed, As Jeremy Black mentioned last night, what we call and date World War II was set in motion years more of conflict in Asia. And Keith Lowe said that in Europe, after the war ended, Reconstruction began. I recommend Ron Spector's book, A Continent Erupts. He traced how war in Asia began, was continued during the post-war period. He explained that two great waves crashed. The first was nationalism, in which Korea, India, Vietnam, and Indonesia demanded the end of colonial rule by the United Kingdom, France, and the Netherlands. The second wave crashed because nationalists demanding decolonization were divided. Some were conservative. Others wanted not only independence, but also transformation of their societies. Asian communist parties were the most vocal and organized advocates of radical change, and they were not squeamish about using violence to achieve their visions. On VJ Day in 1945, because the recognized legal government in China was the Republic of China, nationalist China, led by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, it was a nationalist general who signed the surrender on the USS Missouri. Another accepted the surrender of Japanese forces in Nanjing. Chiang's nationalist army sent troops to reclaim Taiwan from Japan, which had held the island since 1895. Chiang's government received financial assistance from the United States. His government was seated at the United Nations. And the Generalissimo's wife, Madame Chiang, or the Missimo, was an internationally admired figure. Chiang and Mao met for one victory dinner in 1945 and never again met. They were both in motion when the war against the Japanese ended. Relying on troop carrier units of the U.S. Army Air Forces and U.S. Navy shipping, Chiang moved troops north, reestablishing nationalist rule and stationing troops in large cities. He moved the government from Chongqing back to Nanjing. The United States deployed 2 divisions of Marines to North China, which allowed the nationalists to return and reestablish the authority of Chiang's government in cities like Beijing. The communists moved to occupy provinces as the Japanese left. In each new area they controlled, they continued the land reform, carrots and sticks that they had perfected in the liberated areas during the war. This was violent. Figures vary, but estimates range into millions of deaths from the party's land reform. The Soviets had invaded Manchuria as the atomic bombs were dropped, and they quickly defeated the Japanese armies in that northeast province in their 3-week campaign. As they left, the Soviets left the next year, they gave the Chinese communists almost all the weapons they had seized from the Japanese. Elsewhere, the communists made deals with evacuating Japanese commanders to turn over their weapons. These new weapons certainly gave more power to the communist movement. Now, we need another conference to cover the Chinese Civil War. Both sides deployed armies and hundreds of thousands of troops. President Truman sent General George Marshall to China to try and broker a compromise that would end the Civil War, but the effort failed. He came to China at a moment when both sides thought they could defeat the other, and both nationalists and communists aimed for a win rather than a negotiated settlement. Full-scale war erupted in 1946, 1947, and 1948. Here and there, some deft nationalist moves led to temporary victories, but support for the nationalist cause was dissolving. A major factor was rampant inflation, as the nationalists printed money to cover their heavy expenditures. And the corruption among nationalist generals and officials continued unabated. It even increased. By 1948, vigorous communist campaigns made stronger because of millions of militia and peasants supported the communist troops, steadily increased communist control of key cities and provinces, beginning in the north and moving southward. Also, many nationalist commanders defected, bringing their commands with them. Nationalists yesterday, communists today. By 1948, the speed of the communist movements kept the nationalists off balance. Chiang Kai-shek again moved the nationalist government from Nanjing to southwest China, but isolated into a corner of China, and seeing the defection of many nationalist formations to the communist side, he left the mainland for Taiwan, Formosa, where the Republic of China, often characterized as Free China, continued. And the nationalists held onto China's United Nations seat until 1972. Formosa eventually became the democratic, prosperous, dynamic, and free Taiwan we know today. My theme today has been that China's subsequent history after VJ, China's civil war, the communist victory, the movement of Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan, the proclamation of the People's Republic of China, and even the Korean War was shaped, even foreshadowed, by World War II in China. On October 1st, 1949, when Chairman Mao declared that China has stood up and proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China, there was a hopeful belief that the years of war, civil war, bombing, refugees, violence, hunger, misery, and uncountable deaths would end. These were hopes, even some exhilaration, but they were born of exhaustion. War in Korea, the Great Leap Forward and its associated famine, and the Cultural Revolution added millions more deaths. Taiwan, PRC policies to keep religious expression under its thumb, the growth of its military, naval, and air power, its allegations that the United States stands in the way of China's rightful rise to prominence, show that even now, demons loosed by 8 years of World War II in China still range into our present, and they are not yet spent. Thank you.
Rather than continue our conversation, I will just declare Bravo Zulu, which for Navy for well done, and we'll turn to the audience for questions which may be directed to the speakers.
We will start to your right, gentlemen, towards the front.
This question's for Mr. Lowe. My uncle served in the Army of the Occupation in Germany. He wrote for the Stars and Stripes. And one of the things I remembered was that he talked a lot about all the DPs that he could see. When you talk about Warsaw being 90% destroyed, where could the DPs go? What happened to them? And who cleaned up all the rubble?
Yeah, I mean, DPs were everywhere. I mean, the estimates for Germany in May 1945 are about 8 million displaced persons from other countries who have been brought into Germany as slave laborers. That's before you even count, prisoners of war and so on. There's 8 million people from other countries being used to work in the factories and the fields and so on. All these people have to be sent home, and that's the major project. That's the first thing that the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, that's what they want to do. They just want to send everybody home. The problem is that a lot of them don't want to go home, especially Polish people who, parts of Eastern Poland aren't Poland anymore. They're now the Soviet Union. So they don't want to go there. Even the rest of Poland is under communist control. They're nervous about going back to a communist country, so they don't want to go. Actually, I told you, this guy, Andrei, this friend of mine, he was in this DP camp for 10 years after the war. He didn't leave Germany until 1955, and it was only because someone discovered miraculously, that his dad was still alive and was living in London. So that's how he ended up in London and how I ended up meeting him in London. So there are all these populations all over Europe, sort of traveling in all directions, trying to get home after the war, and the Allies are trying to help them home. But then there's all these others who don't want to go and don't know where to go. It's, I don't know if that answers your question.
The other part of that was the rubble.
The rubble. Yes, who cleared up the rubble? Well, there's famously the Trümmerfrauen, who, you know, the local populations are conscripted to clear up some of the mess. But, you know, it doesn't get cleared up for years. Like I said, the bomb site opposite where I lived, that was still there in the 1970s, piles of rubble. It was only when a building company came in and used the site, and it was valuable real estate by then. So you know, it takes years. It doesn't just happen overnight. It takes decades, in fact.
Next
Yeah,
question.
the irony is that Japan and Germany in many ways recovered more rapidly than the conquered cities and countries and parts of the Alliance. My uncle was sending care packages to an English family that he lived with into the 1960s.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is one of the things that if there is a kind of silver lining to such destruction, it means is that when you do rebuild, you can rebuild with all the newest technology, better housing, and so on. And in Britain, we still kept the old stuff and tried to patch things together, you know, in our typical British bumbling way.
Particularly the heating systems.
Yeah.
Next question's in the front to your left, gentlemen.
This question's for Keith. You had mentioned, Keith, that there is persecution of Jews after the war. Was this done more on an individual-to-individual level, or was there any type of organized persecution by people in positions of authority? And I guess second part to this is, were those people in authority, were they from before the war as well? Were many of those people at the local level in positions of leadership and government and things, were they also after the war continuing in those positions?
Yeah, good question. There was a lot of individual acts of violence. I mean, one of the when the Jews all get sort of moved out and sent off to ghettos and concentration camps and so on, their property is shared out amongst the local community. So, you know, people get to move into a new apartment. Furniture is given to people. There are lots of poor people who they're getting this clothing which used to be owned by Jews, and they're really happy. You know, they're now walking around in somebody else's overcoat. They don't want the Jews to come back and reclaim their property, and those few who did come back to their villages and towns often found a hostile population who had come to regard this property as their own now. And so they would like to encourage these returning Jews to just please go back away again, you know? And that encouragement, if you can put it like that, was often violent. But there was also some connivance amongst, certainly in local administrations. You know, the Kielce pogrom is an example where the local administration didn't exactly clamp down on what was happening, and in fact some local officials joined in with the violence. So that does happen too. It's not official in the way that it was when the Nazis were in control, but there's certainly some connivance between officials and local thugs.
Next question's with Connie, all the way to the back to your right, please.
Hello. This question's for Mr. Lowe. You talked about all the violence that was going on in Europe after the war, and I was kind of surprised that you didn't mention Greece and the fighting that was going on between the communists and the royalists, which my understanding is from various friends of mine who are of Greek descent was quite bad and ended up in thousands of dead and didn't end until about 1949 or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. More people were killed in the aftermath of the war, more Greek people were killed in the aftermath of World War II, during the Civil War, than were killed during World War II. It was a really brutal war. And actually, I think there are some parallels, really, with China here. You know, it's this political thing between royalists, nationalists, and communists who are, again, fighting against each other as much as they are against the Germans, and they carry on fighting after the war. I think it's probably similar in China. Do you think, Don?
I could understand that, yeah.
Yeah.
Connie has the next question to your right, halfway back, please.
Thanks. Thanks for your lecture, gentlemen. As one of the prevailing themes of the conference is that in many ways the war really didn't end in 1945 and its influence is felt worldwide even today. Could the gentleman on my right please either validate or debunk a myth, if you will, that I've heard for years, that Claire Chennault's wife, Anna Chennault, was somehow involved in some behind-the-scenes maneuvering during the '68 presidential election, that this involved Nixon. Can you comment on that?
So let's see, General Chennault, when he went to China in the end of the 1930s, he left his family behind. And he had quite a number of children. If you watch that old Army Air Forces film about the Aleutians, you can see General Chennault's son in command of a squadron. So he goes to China, and of course he marries a journalist, Anna Chennault, is her English name. And so after the war, she was a nationalist. She went to the United States, and I met her once. But yes, she became a part of the wing of the Republican Party that was sort of descended from the Who Lost China crowd, and and who ardently supported Chiang Kai-shek and Taiwan. Now, I have not delved into her role in the Republican politics of yes, the late 60s, but I've seen enough hints at it that she must have been how can I say, a mid to minor to mid player in Republican politics. So that's worth another conference.
Next question is center aisle, halfway back to your left, please.
Okay. Oh, thank you. So I have a couple questions. I read a book last year called The Last Million by David Nasaw, and the first question I wanted to ask was, why did Western Europe not take as many Jewish refugees after World War II? The book was saying that even regrettably, some Nazi collaborators from the Baltic countries were brought in to deal with the labor shortages. And the second question is, were American DP camps better for Jewish refugees than the French, British, or I guess probably certainly the Soviet refugee camps? Thank you.
Right, okay, well, you're right about Baltic people, for example, people from Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, came to Britain. There was actually an official program to bring these people to Britain after the war. They didn't want to go back to these countries because they weren't countries anymore. This was now the Soviet Union. And a lot of these people were sort of tainted with collaboration with the Nazis. But they were brought to Britain. The reason why we wanted these people was because they were nice, white, Christian people who the Brits felt would sort of fit in very easily in society. Problematic Jews, you know, women and children, they're not going to economically contribute to British society, so, you know, they're left. They're left in camps. We don't want them. It's not only us, by the way. It's not only British. The Americans are doing the same thing. The Canadians are doing the same thing. They're only taking the people they think will fit in and who they think will contribute economically. Again, I'll go back to my friend Andre. He and his mother applied to go to Australia, to go to Canada, to come to the United States. Nobody wanted them. That's why they stayed in Germany for 10 years. It was only when they discovered his father that he was able to come to Britain, because his father already had citizenship there. So yes, it's sort of murky and unpleasant. But yeah, this is how it worked in the time. There was a second part of that question. I seem.
The difference between the camps, the American refugee camps, French, British, and Soviet.
Right, okay. I don't know about refugee camps so much, because the refugee camps were generally run by United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. They were UNRWA camps. So this is an international rescue effort. They are in different zones of Germany. I mean, the British zone was a bit more smashed up than the American zone was, so there might be some reasons there why life was a bit more difficult. I do know that when it comes to prisoners of war, there was a very stark difference between survival rates in different camps. If you were in an American camp, you were less likely as a German prisoner of war to survive than if you were in a British camp, largely because the Brits let them go much sooner, whereas the Americans held on to them they wanted to try these people and sort the sheep from the goats. And of course, in the Russian camps, they were there for 10 years and terrible conditions, so they're much less likely to survive there. So that's not about DPs, that's about prisoners of war. So I'm sorry if I'm fudging the answer there a little bit for you.
We'll stay with Connie in the center aisle, gentlemen.
This question is directed towards Keith. In 1968, as a teenager, I had a chance to tour Eastern Europe, and I saw some of the rubble in Warsaw that you were describing, but the greatest contrast was in Berlin. In East Berlin, there were still rubble-filled blocks. But you go over to West Berlin, and it's like New York City in modern times. And my question is, how much of this disparity was due to deliberate Soviet intentions, either to weaken the people, destroy opposition, and set things up for later exploitation in Eastern Europe?
Great question. I think there are two things going on there. First of all, the Soviets are much more into punishing the Germans. They don't want to reconstruct Germany immediately. The first thing they want to do is remove sort of reparations, really, for the damage they've experienced. So they remove a lot of the machinery. They're not interested in rebuilding to start off with. They just want to take stuff back home to help rebuild back home. So there's that. But then there's also what one of the sessions yesterday was all about, the Marshall Plan. There's a huge amount of money comes into West Berlin to help rebuild. That doesn't happen in East Berlin. So it takes a lot longer for the eastern parts of Europe to go through this reconstruction process than it does in the West.
Next question is going to be halfway back to your right, gentlemen, with Connie. Joe, you can stand.
Could you please talk about efforts to relocate displaced Jews to Palestine, and about how many were relocated between 45 and 48 with the creation of the state of Israel?
Yeah. Okay, this is where we get into my national shame. Because, of course, Palestine is administered by the British at this time. And they're doing everything they can to stop Jews coming from Europe to Palestine. Because, I mean, we're seeing it play out today, aren't we? The problems between local Palestinians and Jews, some of whom were born in Palestine and others who are coming newly to Palestine. That was all going on back then. It's been going on for a century. Jews and Palestinians fighting against one another. Jewish groups, of course, are doing their best to bypass the British kind of blockade, and there's a whole escape route through the Mediterranean that they get ships full of Jewish refugees which come into Haifa. Some of them get through, some of them don't, most of them don't. Those that don't get through are interned, put into DP camps on Cyprus, and they're the conditions that, you've just escaped from a concentration camp, you're now in a DP camp, and then you manage to escape, you think you're going to get somewhere where you're safe, and the British lock you up again in yet another camp. I mean, it must be really traumatic for a population who are already traumatized. In terms of numbers, I mean, I'm not sure of the numbers. I can tell you that 300,000 Jews were chased out of Poland in 46, 47, and they had to find somewhere to go. They started off in DP camps in Germany and tried to make their way down. But as for I don't know, I just don't know the immigration figures of the time. Everything changed, of course, in 1948 when Israel is declared, and then people are free to come. But that was a difficult time. Those 3 years, really sort of murky time.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I think that those of us who study history of the war and its aftermath run into lots of stories from lots of people that seem, on the face of it, incredible. And one of the things I learned was it probably happened, and that every time you hear one of these unbelievable stories of survival, I think you have to give the person the benefit of the doubt, because at least in my experience, very often the story is rooted in fact. I played golf one day with a veteran of the Charlemagne Division who'd been an officer, SS officer, and had survived life on the Eastern Front to the point where they evacuated Vienna and were trying to figure out how to get back to France alive. And the first thing they did was they ditched all their German uniforms, but they kept their vehicles and weapons. And they kept looking for Americans. The last thing they wanted to do was to run into Free French or Russians or somebody else that they couldn't fool. They figured they could fool the Americans. So they got to Czechoslovakia, got to the border, and they found an American outpost, and so they ditched their vehicles and their weapons and kind of trooped into the American zone. And they were asked who they were, and they said that, well, they were Frenchmen who had been forced laborers for the Third Reich, and that they were trying to get back to France. And they rolled up their sleeves and showed that they had numbers tattooed on their arms, which was common in the SS. And the Americans accepted them as DPs, and they sort of survived. But then the Free French found them, but several months later, and by that time they were not shooting members of the SS or Frenchmen, and they gave them a choice to either stay in jail or they could volunteer to serve in Indochina, which they took up immediately. Now, they couldn't go into the Foreign Legion because they're still technically Frenchmen by nationality, so they went into the Troupes de Marine, which is where I had some associations. And this gentleman, Mr. Roy, that I talked with, had not only survived Indochina and Algeria, but had ended up as one of Charles de Gaulle's bodyguards in the late 1950s. And then he became a regional sales manager for the Ford Motor Company. And I asked, how did he manage that? And he said, well, I had lots of qualifications. He said, I spoke several languages and served in many different countries. let it go at that. And I have verified his story from other sources. And I think what's interesting is I don't think that was unique, that you could find lots of people who had experiences like that would take your breath away, and you wouldn't believe them to begin with, and yet they almost invariably turn out to be based on fact.
Yeah. Next question, center aisle with Connie to your left, please.
I'm curious why, communist China didn't, why they didn't move on Taiwan earlier. I mean, with all the discussion going on today about that.
Well, the communist armies during the Civil War had all participated in land campaigns. And I can't think of any amphibious landings made by the Chinese troops during either the war or afterwards. So there have been a few recent studies on this. If you see me afterwards, I could think of where you could look for them. But it's a fair distance from the mainland to Taiwan, and to have actually it was beyond their capacity to organize, get some Higgins boats, and then cross that long distance. And they didn't have a huge fleet to be able to launch the Higgins boats from. So so that it was beyond their capacity at the time, their capacity and their experience.
I have a question for both. Keith, with your book, Prisoners, and with Don, your experience with the commemorations. We just went through the 100th anniversary of the Great War. Where are we in 20 years, now that we're in the 80th anniversary of World War II? Where are we 100 years from World War II? In Europe, how is it remembered on the scale of World War I? And in Asia, how is China seeing this in 20 years?
I'll go first.
Right.
Okay, well, I mean, World War II was way bigger than World War I. It involved much more of the continent. In World War I, the lines were pretty static for a long time. So the horrible as the war was, it was mostly concentrated in a smaller area. Whereas with the great big mobile campaigns of World War II, it really ranged over the entire continent. We also had aeroplanes, of course, in World War II. So cities got smashed up in a way that in World War I, there just wasn't the capability for that. So World War II is seen much more as a kind of Armageddon, right, for Europe. And all our myths of the post-war world are born out of this. The old world has been destroyed and a new world has blossomed, risen like a phoenix from the ashes afterwards. That's the way we remember World War II, as a sort of not only a catastrophe, but also a new beginning. There is this sort of rebuilding. So yeah, that's how I think generally we remember it in Europe?
Well, to answer your question about the way China will regard the war, presuming that there's no particular shakeup of Chinese society, that the Communist Party is still ruling China, the principle is that history that's taught in schools and universities, written in textbooks, any history published in China has interpretations, can only have interpretations that redeem, that support the rule of the party, and that the rule of the party was justified, could be seen as justified by its experience during the war. So that those skirmishes I talked about, nationalist battles and communist skirmishes, the skirmishes become battles. So history that is rewritten or written in order to support the party in Chinese is called main melody history. And I recommend that you watch some of the recent Chinese movies. There are many of them stream. For instance, there's, anyway, I won't go into all the movies, but they show the Chinese efforts both in the war and then the Civil War and in the Korean War. They portray them as great victories of the Chinese nation and of the Communist Party. And for instance, the new movie called in English, The Battle of Changjin, which is about the Chosin Reservoir, that's treated as a great Chinese victory against the Marines. So, well, the Marines did leave, but they left at least three Chinese divisions in tatters. So their view of the war glosses over a few facts because they want to set the main melody. One perhaps change is that little by little the Chinese Communist Party is acknowledging more of the role of the nationalists. So they're beginning to acknowledge, yes, the nationalists were there too, yes, they were corrupt and so on, but there were brave stands made by some nationalist troops. And there were some nationalist generals who could see that China needed change and reform. So, so long as the party sustains its rule over China, in the 100th anniversary, we'll see the same themes, but with perhaps a little more recognition of the fact that the nationalists carried so large a burden in the war.
Can I ask you a question about that, actually? I wanted to know, how much do you think this change in the way the Chinese remember the war, how much do you think of it is actually about the history, and how much of it is about sort of geopolitics today? They're creating a. I'm thinking mostly like the international relations between China and Japan, for example.
Well, Chinese foreign policy has to fit within its domestic policy. And the domestic policies expressed in education and museums and so on is to support the rule of the party and to retrospectively create the image or the interpretation, perhaps, that the party made good decisions. So so that affects how they portray the Second World War, the Korean War, and some of the other events, always to support the party. And that means the party made big errors, like the billions died of famine in the 50s, but those are sort of mistakes, rather than examples of terrible brutality, and indifference by Chairman Mao. So since the domestic control and continuation of the party is first, then the way the war is portrayed is, derives from it. And even, at conferences and so on where Americans can participate, the Chinese listen and take notes, but they, in the end, what they write is that main melody history.
We have a question to your right, about a third of the way back, gentlemen.
Thank you. This is for Keith. What was happening to the displaced persons in the camps? Were they being processed in some way? Did they have hopes of getting out of it?
Yeah, I mean, the first priority is to get them home. And I mean, sometimes they're sent home against their will. I mean, there's sort of there's some famous instances of Ukrainians, for example, who are sent back to the Soviet Union against their will. They don't even know that that's where they're going sometimes. And you can imagine their fate when they arrived there, since a lot of them had collaborated with the Germans. So they didn't last long. Similar things happened with the Yugoslavs. Some of those who had collaborated with the Germans, the British sent them back across the border. They met a sticky end as well. But generally speaking, people want to go home. So it's just a matter of logistics, right? You've got a smashed transport system. There's only a certain number of trains and trucks and planes to go round. So it's a slow process of getting them home. In the meantime, they've got to sort of sit there and wait. And whole societies form in these camps, and they set up education systems. There's lots of old teachers who've been through the war who then think, well, I'm sitting around doing nothing in this DP camp. I may as well teach the kids here. So they start up lessons. There's even a DP university is created in some of these camps. So they create a sort of their own new society in these places, and they have to, because these DP camps are around for a long time. As I said, up in the mid-1950s, the last ones are closing down. So yeah, they're doing their best. It takes time.
If I could add just one thought. At the end of the Korean War, South Korea, the United States held many Chinese prisoners. And part of the truce arrangements were that every single Chinese prisoner in the camps in Korea would be interviewed by the Indian Army. India sent some units, and every single Chinese prisoner sat in front of an officer from India and said, I want to go home to China, or I'd like to go to Taiwan. And there's a novel about this written by the son of one of those Chinese prisoners. It's called War Trash by Ha Jin. And it talks about that compressed world in the POW camps where there's a struggle going on between the Chinese prisoners who are for the PRC and those who want to go to Taiwan, even if they're not from Taiwan, and then how it plays out in their lives. So if you're, I know you all have books, tall stacks of books on the war, but you need a break. You need a novel, and the Korean War will give you the break. War Trash by Ha Jin. And I think some of the insights could be compared to the stresses on the DPs, on where they will go or not go.
Well, there were Chinese nationalist agents which had infiltrated the camps being run by the UNC, and part of their job was to convince Chinese soldiers not to go home, and one of the ways they did that was they grabbed them and then tattooed on their bodies in Chinese, "I hate communists." this was not a good deal for somebody who wanted to go back to China.
Well, of course, the Chinese and the North Koreans had their political officers be captured.
Yeah.
So that they would go to the camps and they would do the same kind of organization to, the way I heard the story was I hate commies. And so, anyway.
I mean, there's similar things. There were Soviet agents in DP camps as well, also trying to convince people to go back to the Soviet Union. So, yeah.
This is the subject of a whole new conference.
Yeah.
We're going to have a question in the front row, all the way to your right, gentlemen.
Hey, a question for Don. Thanks to both of you, though. You know, we'd like to think that the war ends and then it's peace. But in the case of China, you still have the OSS for several years conducting the raids on the China coast. You know, the raiders on the China coast and some other pieces where they have some agents assisting in the Civil War. Is that something you could talk about today?
Okay, that's a path I haven't gone down in my own research.
Yeah, these are you know, former mostly OSS officers that are running these PT boat squadrons to kind of raid the coast up until the Korean War, and then surprise the Koreans enter the war with us. But
yeah,
you know, maybe that'll be the next conference as well, right?
That's okay. That's a good panel.
Well, then maybe.
Yeah, but I'm sorry.
No, it's great.
That little corner of it, I haven't really.
But it's a kind of the covert ops piece that we leave out of the narrative so often. You know, where the irregular war continues even after the regular war supposedly is done.
Well, I have the feeling that this kind of let's call it reconnaissance, or you know, these efforts to understand China, perhaps have a few people in China, they were certainly continued into the Korean War, and you had officers of the CIA held in Chinese prisons for some decades, actually, who had been captured, you know, after some flights into China.
Ladies and gentlemen, Allan Millett, Keith Lowe, and Donald Bishop.